In the records of modern military history, few battles are as legendary as the Battle of Midway. Fought from June 4th to June 7th, 1942, this clash between the United States and Imperial Japan unfolded near the tiny atoll of Midway, located northwest of Hawaii. The battle marked a crucial turning point, shifting the balance of power in the Pacific towards the Allies. At the heart of this historic showdown were the American and Japanese crews and their airplanes. In this two-part series, we embark on an exploration of the aircraft operated by the United States during the pivotal Battle of Midway. We'll concentrate on the aircraft carrier and land-based airplanes, omitting coverage of the U.S. Navy cruiser-based float planes. If you would like to see a similar video for the Japanese aircraft, please let us know in the comments below. Let's start with the deadliest airplanes involved in the Battle of Midway, the dive bombers. These aircraft were designed to drop bombs accurately on targets by diving steeply towards them. The American dive bomber crews were responsible for sinking 5 Japanese warships during the decisive encounter. The Vought SB-2U Vindicator, the U.S. Navy's first monoplane dive bomber, was developed in the mid-1930s. By the time the United States entered the Second World War, it was already an outdated model. Vindicator's slow speed and limited maneuverability made it vulnerable against the more advanced Japanese Zero fighter. 17 U.S. Marine Corps Vindicators were based at Midway Atoll during this decisive battle. In the early hours of June 4th, before the initial Japanese airstrike planes arrived at Midway, most American bombers took flight and directed their course towards the reported position of the enemy's aircraft carriers. The Japanese striking fleet, led by Admiral Nagumo, consisted of 4 aircraft carriers and several cruisers, destroyers, and other support ships. Around 8:30 a.m., 11 Vindicators launched an air attack on the Japanese cruiser Haruna. However, none of the bombs dropped by the brave American crews hit their intended target. In the process, 2 of the Vindicators were shot down by the Japanese. Later that day, following the sinking of the 4 Japanese carriers, Vindicators based at Midway, alongside some Dauntless aircraft, endeavored to locate and attack the remainder of the enemy fleet. Unfortunately, the American pilots were unable to find any Japanese ships. In the early hours of June 5, 1942, Vindicators and Dauntless aircraft from Midway initiated an assault on the cruisers Mogami and Mikuma. Captain Richard Fleming, leading the Vindicator section, directed his bombers in a glide bombing attack. Fleming's Vindicator was struck. Nevertheless, he pressed on with his attack on the Japanese cruiser Mikuma. Despite being hit, he released his bomb, scoring a near miss on the stern of his target before crashing into the sea. Captain Fleming was posthumously awarded the nation's highest military decoration, the Medal of Honor, for his bravery. After the Battle of Midway, the Vindicators were withdrawn from frontline active service and ultimately retired in 1945. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was a World War II American single-engine, low-wing monoplane, naval scout plane, and dive bomber. Douglas Aircraft manufactured it from 1939 through 1944. The Dauntless dive bomber is best remembered as the bomber that delivered the fatal blows to the Japanese carriers in the Battle of Midway in June 1942. The SBD, or Scout Bomber Douglas, would, in fact, live up to the nickname given to it by its crews, slow but deadly. During the Battle of Midway, multiple squadrons operated from aircraft carriers within Task Force 16, Task Force 17, and Midway Atoll. Task Force 16 comprised the aircraft carriers Enterprise and Hornet, while Task Force 17 centered around the aircraft carrier Yorktown. The initial assault on the Japanese Navy by the Marine Corps' Dauntless took place on June 4, 1942, around 8 a.m. The attack was executed by the Marines of Scout Bomber Squadron 241, stationed at Midway. Of the 16 dive bombers deployed, 8 were lost, and no hits were registered against the enemy ships. Later that morning, at 10:20 a.m., following numerous unsuccessful American assaults, the Japanese Navy was caught off guard by the Dauntless aircraft from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown. Approaching from 2 separate directions, approximately 50 dive bombers descended upon the Japanese carriers without opposition. The Zero fighters were engaged in repelling a low-altitude attack by American torpedo bombers and couldn't protect the aircraft carriers. The outcome was catastrophic for the Japanese Navy, with 3 out of 4 carriers being incapacitated and later sunk by the audacious American attack. In the afternoon, 2 groups of Dauntless dive bombers were launched from the American carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Their mission was to locate and eliminate the last remaining Japanese carrier, Hiryu. The Hiryu was hit multiple times by bombs dropped by the Dauntless and eventually sank. The successful execution of this decisive action ultimately tipped the scales in favor of the Americans, sealing the fate of the Battle of Midway. The following 2 days, the Americans pressed on with their attacks on the remaining enemy units. Several Japanese ships were still within range of the American aircraft. As a result of the actions on June 5th and 6th, the American dive bombers successfully sank the cruiser Mikuma and dealt heavy damage to the Mogami and the destroyer Ratio. After the Battle of Midway, the SBD Dauntless continued to play a significant role in the Pacific theater of World War II. Its success at Midway solidified its reputation as one of the most effective dive bombers of the war. During the Battle of Midway, the United States deployed traditional land-based bombers, which might seem surprising given the nature of this naval battle. While these bombers didn't play as significant a role as other types of aircraft, the Americans learned valuable lessons into their potential application in the Pacific theater of war. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was an American 4-engine heavy bomber aircraft developed in the 1930s for the United States Army Air Corps. Renowned for its speed and high-altitude capabilities, the B-17 became a staple bomber during World War II. While primarily deployed in the European theater of operations, it also saw action in various battles and campaigns across the Pacific. During the Battle of Midway, the U.S. Army Air Force's B-17s conducted long-range patrols and participated in high-altitude bombing runs on the Japanese Navy. Let's see how the Flying Fortresses performed during this decisive battle. On May 31, 1942, a group of 17 Flying Fortresses arrived at Midway from Hawaii in preparation for the impending defense of Midway. On June 3rd, in the early morning, a Flying Fortress on a long-range patrol detected Japanese units approaching the American base from the west. These turned out to be ships from the Midway Occupation Force, not to be confused with Admiral Nagumo's carrier striking force. Later that day, around 12:30 p.m., a squadron of 9 bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney Jr., embarked on a mission to target the Japanese fleet. By 4:20 p.m., Admiral Reizo Tanaka's Midway Occupation Force was sighted approximately 570 miles west of Midway when came under attack. While American pilots reported several hits, the damage inflicted on the Japanese ships was minor, allowing the invading fleet to proceed with their mission without delays. In the early hours of June 4th, 15 Flying Fortresses set out once more to target the Midway Occupation Fleet. However, the formation received radio orders to redirect their course and bomb the Japanese carrier striking force, positioned northwest of Midway. During the journey, one B-17 experienced mechanical issues and had to turn back to base. At 8:10 a.m., American pilots spotted the Japanese carriers, prompting them to initiate their bomb run. At that moment, the American airplanes were flying 20,000 feet above the enemy ships. The Japanese anti-aircraft fire proved ineffective, and the Zero fighters had little time to intercept the bombers flying at high altitude. Despite this, the American pilots were unable to score hits on any of the Japanese ships. They only managed to achieve near misses on the carriers Soryu and Hiryu. After the attack, all the B-17s safely made their way back to Midway. The B-17's actions and other American attacks played an important role in keeping the Japanese aircraft carrier crews occupied with defending their ships. Despite their limited effectiveness, these assaults delayed the Japanese from launching their own offensive against the U.S. carriers. As we mentioned before, 3 of the Japanese carriers were disabled that morning, and later that same day the last remaining carrier was struck and incapacitated. After the 4 Japanese carriers were put out of action, 3 more attacks were launched using B-17s against the remaining ships of the Japanese fleet. These attacks originated from both Midway and Hawaii. However, they failed to cause any damage to the enemy. On June 5th, 3 additional bombing sorties were conducted targeting the retreating Japanese ships. Once again, they failed to score any hits on their targets. According to some sources, 2 B-17s were lost when they ran out of fuel and were forced to make emergency landings at sea. By June 10, 1942, all the surviving B-17s had departed Midway, flying back to Hickam Field in Hawaii. Following the Battle of Midway, the U.S. Armed Forces re-evaluated the effectiveness of using high-altitude bombers when targeting moving objectives. Despite numerous missions against the Japanese Navy, American bombers were unable to score any hits on their intended targets. Nonetheless, in the years to follow, the B-17 emerged as one of the most influential bombers in World War II. The Martin B-26 Marauder was an American twin-engine medium bomber that saw extensive service during World War II. It was first used in the Pacific theater in early 1942. Later, it saw widespread use in the Mediterranean and in Western Europe. Upon its introduction into service with the United States Army aviation units in early 1941, The aircraft swiftly gained the reputation of a widowmaker owing to the high accident rate of its early models during takeoffs and landings. Later, the B-26 design underwent several modifications, resulting in a safer aircraft after introducing aerodynamic improvements and retraining crews. Interestingly, by the end of World War II, the Marauder had the lowest loss rate of any U.S. Army Air Forces bomber. However, despite this achievement, it still faced criticism from some of its pilots throughout its military service. Among the numerous accounts of the Battle of Midway lies a little-known story of an extraordinary mission carried out by 4 B-26 Martin Marauder bombers under the command of Captain James J. Collins. Let's explore the courageous torpedo attacks executed by these 4 B-26s of the 22nd and 38th Bomb Groups against the Japanese fleet. In preparation for the upcoming battle, a small number of Marauders underwent hasty changes to enable them to launch torpedoes. These modified bombers arrived at Midway just a few days before the battle. Early in the morning of June 4th, Jim Collins's crews were on runway alert when word came that enemy airplanes were approaching Midway. The B-26s took off immediately with no fighter escort and headed for the Japanese striking force that lay 180 miles, or 290 kilometers to the northwest. Flying in a diamond formation at 700 feet, the bombers descended to 200 feet to make their torpedo attack. As the American airplanes approached their target, they were met head-on by Japanese Zero fighters, which, in an effort to protect their carriers, they pursued the American bombers relentlessly through a barrage of anti-aircraft fire. After dropping its torpedoes, 1 B-26, nicknamed the Suzy Q, was pursued by numerous fighters. Seeking an escape route, the B-26 flew down the flight deck of the Akagi, nearly grazing the bridge, braving heavy anti-aircraft fire, forcing the pursuing Japanese fighters to stop firing temporarily to avoid hitting their own ship. In recognition of his bravery, Lieutenant James P. Morey, the pilot of the Suzy Q, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Another B-26, seriously damaged by anti-aircraft fire, did not pull out of its run and instead flew directly at Akagi's bridge. Either attempting a suicide ramming or out of control, the plane narrowly missed striking the carrier's bridge and crashed into the ocean. Unfortunately for the Americans, their torpedoes failed to hit any Japanese ships, although the B-26 crews shot down 1 Zero fighter and killed 2 seamen aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi with machine gun fire. The 2 surviving B-26s roared across the Japanese fleet at maximum speed until they were able to hide in the clouds. Both badly damaged bombers limped back to Midway, where they crash-landed and were written off. The dramatic torpedo attack by Army B-26 Marauders of the 22nd and 38th Bomb Groups forced Japanese Admiral Nagumo to delay his battle plan, a decision that set the stage for the incredible American victory at the Battle of Midway. As we conclude our exploration of the American dive bombers and bomber planes in the Battle of Midway, it's clear that these aircraft played pivotal roles in shaping the course of this decisive battle. In the years to come, the bravery of its crews contributed significantly to the ultimate Allied victory in the Pacific theater of World War II. In Part 2 of this miniseries, we will cover the American fighters, torpedo bombers, and scout planes. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. If you found the content engaging and informative, please consider giving it a thumbs up. Your likes inspire us to continue bringing you more captivating stories. Don't forget to subscribe and activate the notifications bell. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our upcoming content, ensuring you never miss out our future episodes. Thank you for being a part of our growing community. We look forward to seeing you in our next history series.